On the 14th of August, 1827, Josiah Crane, a plantation owner, amongst the rice fields surrounding Charleston, South Carolina, was discovered dead within his library. His skull had been so catastrophically shattered that physicians examining the remains noted fragments of bone embedded in the mahogany desk some 6 feet distant. The coroner's report, preserved still within the Charleston County archives, stated that the injuries were consistent with compression by hands considerably larger and more powerful than those of any ordinary human being. The only person who might conceivably have inflicted such damage was a woman standing 6 feet 8 inches tall, weighing upwards of 17 stone of solid muscle, who had vanished into the August darkness without trace. For nearly 2 centuries now, the local historians have debated whether Sarah Drummond truly existed or whether she was merely a story conjured from fear and guilt. Yet the medical records, the sale documents, the eyewitness testimony all point towards something rather more disturbing, that she was real, and that what transpired in that library represented the culmination of years of accumulated horror. Before we continue with the story of Sarah Drummond and the night that shocked Charleston society into a silence lasting generations, if you enjoy these untold stories from history, do consider subscribing. It really does help the channel grow. Let us return to the beginning of this nightmare. Money, not violence, lies at the heart of Sarah Drummond's story. In the spring of 1823, the port of Charleston was experiencing one of its most vigorous trading seasons in decades. Weekly, ships arrived from the Caribbean, West Africa, and Virginia's tobacco-growing regions, delivering human beings to be sold at the markets on Chalmers Street and Gadsden's Wharf. Charleston wasn't simply a port city, it was the epicenter of the domestic slave trade in the American South, where fortunes were built buying and selling people as readily as one might trade cotton bales or rice barrels. The rice plantations surrounding Charleston were particularly brutal places to labor. Rice cultivation differed markedly from cotton farming. Workers stood for hours in water in swamps teeming with malarial mosquitoes, venomous snakes and alligators. The mortality rate amongst enslaved workers on rice plantations was staggering. Historical estimates suggest nearly 30% of those laboring in the rice fields perished within their first year. The work proved so dangerous, so exhausting, so deadly, that plantation owners found themselves constantly purchasing new workers to replace those who had died. It was a grim economic calculation. Slave traders scoured the southern states seeking strong, healthy workers capable of withstanding the harsh conditions of the rice swamps. Occasionally, they discovered something unusual, something that would command an extraordinary price. In March 1823, a slave trader named Caleb Rutherford arrived in Charleston with a coffle of 37 people acquired in Virginia and North Carolina. Amongst them stood a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20 years of age, who immediately drew attention due to her extraordinary size. Auction house records indicate she measured approximately 7 feet in height, with a frame both broad and powerfully muscled. Witnesses reported she had to stoop to pass through doorways, and that her hands were so large they could encompass a man's entire head. The auction papers listed her name simply as Sarah. First sale documents often omitted surnames. She had been born on a small farm in Piedmont, North Carolina, to an enslaved woman whose name history has failed to preserve. Sarah appears to have suffered from what modern medicine would identify as pituitary gigantism, a rare disorder caused by excessive growth hormone production, typically resulting from a benign tumor on the pituitary gland. But in the 1820s, such medical understanding didn't exist. Those who saw by science. Sarah perceived only an anomaly, a curiosity, and potentially a very valuable one. The auction took place on a sweltering Tuesday morning in late March. The auction house on Chalmers Street filled with planters, merchants, and those merely curious about the giant woman. When Sarah was brought onto the platform, her wrists and ankles still shackled, the crowd began to murmur. She stood nearly a full head taller than the auctioneer, a corpulent man named James Vanderhorst. Vanderhorst had conducted thousands of such sales, yet later confided to friends he had never witnessed anything quite like her. Bidding opened at $400, already a substantial sum, It rose swiftly to 800, then 1,000. Planters shouted their offers, each attempting to outbid the others. They saw in Sarah not merely a worker, but a spectacle, someone who could attract visitors and be exhibited. The winning bid came from a man standing towards the rear of the room. Josiah Crane paid $1,300 for Sarah Drummond, one of the highest prices ever recorded for a single enslaved person at a Charleston auction that year. Crane was a rice planter who owned Marsh Bend, a middling plantation some 18 miles southwest of Charleston, deep in the Low Country's tidal swamps and winding rivers. He was 42 years old, a widower, and known amongst other planters as a strict manager who tolerated no softness in handling enslaved workers. Witnesses reported that Sarah made no sound as she was led from the auction block, her wrists bound, Crane's property mark burned into a leather collar round her neck. She neither wept nor resisted. She simply stared straight ahead with dark, unreadable eyes, her massive body moving with a strange, quiet grace. Those shackled, none present at that auction could have known what they had just witnessed. They couldn't have imagined they were watching the beginning of a story that would end in blood, mystery, and a legend that would haunt the Low Country for generations. Yet perhaps there was some premonition, according to the records, as Crane led Sarah towards his wagon for the journey to Marsh Bend. An elderly woman in the crowd, a free black woman who sold flowers near the market, was heard to say, "That man just bought his own death." If you're finding this fascinating, do hit subscribe. It helps us uncover more stories like this. Marsh Bend Plantation possessed all the qualities that made the Low Country famous, and all those that rendered it a living hell for those compelled to work there. The main house was a 2-story Georgian structure with white columns and a broad veranda overlooking rice fields that stretched towards the Ashley River. Behind stood the kitchen building, the overseer's cottage, a barn, a rice mill, and a row of 12 slave cabins constructed from rough-hewn wood with dirt floors and no windows. Beyond those lay the fields, hundreds of acres of meticulously engineered rice paddies connected by an elaborate network of dikes, ditches, and floodgates controlling the tidal water flow, essential to rice cultivation. Sarah arrived at Marsh Bend in late March 1823 and was assigned to cabin number 7, which she would share with 5 other women. Porter Grimble, the overseer, a thin, nervous man, appeared troubled by her size. In a letter to his brother, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, he wrote that Sarah was so large she had to bend double to enter the cabin, and when she stood upright, she resembled more an ancient colossus than a Christian woman. But Josiah Crane hadn't paid $1,300 for Sarah merely to work the fields. He had something else in mind. Within the first week of her arrival, Crane began exhibiting Sarah to visitors. He would invite neighboring planters, Charleston merchants, even passing gentlemen to Marsh Bend to view the giant he had purchased. They would bring Sarah to the main house, making her stand in the parlor or on the front porch whilst they demonstrated her size and strength. Crane would have her lift heavy objects, rice barrels, iron anvils, even full-grown pigs. He would stand beside her so observers could appreciate how much taller she was. He would instruct her to extend her hands so that men could place their own inside hers, marveling at the difference. Dr. Edmund Porcher, a Charleston physician who visited Marsh Bend in May 1823, recorded a chilling account of these exhibitions in his diary. "Mr. Crane has acquired a female specimen of most extraordinary proportions," Dr. Porcher wrote. "She stands at least 6½ feet in height, perhaps more, with hands and feet of such dimension that I could scarcely credit my own measurements. Her strength appears commensurate with her size. I observed her lift a barrel of rice, weighing no less than 300 pounds, with apparent ease. Mr. Crane informs me he has received numerous offers to purchase her, but he declines, as she has become quite the attraction in our county. I confess the sight of her produced in me an unsettling sensation, as if nature herself had been experimenting with proportions beyond the normal boundaries of the human form. These exhibitions were merely the beginning of Sarah's ordeal at Marsh Bend. When Crane's guests weren't observing her, she was compelled to work in the rice fields, labor that would have broken most people within months. Growing rice in the South Carolina Low Country was brutal, dangerous work. Workers would wade into flooded fields before dawn, standing in water up to their thighs for 10 to 12 hours at a stretch, bent double in the scorching sun, planting, weeding, or harvesting rice. The water was brackish, infested with leeches and water moccasins. Mosquitoes swarmed the air. The heat was overwhelming, the humidity rising from the swamps, making it worse still. Sarah's enormous size made her both valuable and vulnerable. She could carry loads that would require 2 or 3 ordinary workers. The overseer marveled at how quickly and powerfully she could wield the heavy wooden pestles used for threshing rice. But her visibility also made her a target. Crane would often select Sarah for exemplary punishment, not because she had transgressed, but because punishing someone of her size sent a message that no one lay beyond his reach. The punishments were severe. Historical records from rice plantations document whipping posts, wooden stocks, and a device called the buck, where a person would be forced to sit with their knees drawn up, a stick placed beneath their knees and over their arms, immobilizing them for hours in an agonizing position. Sarah endured all of these. Overseer Grimball's letters record that at least 3 times during Sarah's first year at Marsh Bend, she was publicly punished for insolence or refusing to be exhibited. Yet Sarah didn't break, at least not in the manner Crane expected. According to testimony from other enslaved people at Marsh Bend, collected only years later under very different circumstances, Sarah became a figure both feared and relied upon within the community. She was strong enough to perform the most demanding tasks, moving the massive floodgates controlling water flow into the rice fields, hauling timber for repairs, lifting boats from the water. But she was also a protector. People reported she would step between an overseer's whip and a child too young to work. They said she carried workers who had collapsed from heat exhaustion back to their cabins. Stories circulated of her standing motionless and silent whilst Crane attempted to separate mothers from children during sales to other plantations. She spoke little. When she did, her voice was low and steady, carrying an authority that seemed incongruous with her status as property. Some of the older enslaved people at Marsh Bend began calling her Tall Sarah, or simply the Wall, because once she decided to stand somewhere, nothing could shift her without force. And Josiah Crane was beginning to realize that force alone might not be sufficient. A quick note. If you're enjoying this, subscribing really does make a difference. Now back to the story. The first major confrontation between Crane and Sarah occurred in the summer of 1824, some 15 months after her arrival at Marsh Bend. A Charleston man named Augustus Peyton, having heard of the giant slave woman, traveled to Marsh Bend with an offer. He would pay Crane $300 to bring Sarah to Charleston for a fortnight to exhibit her in a traveling show he was assembling, featuring natural curiosities and scientific specimens. The show would include preserved specimens, mechanical devices, and Sarah as the principal attraction. Crane agreed immediately. The opportunity to earn money whilst elevating his standing in Charleston society proved too tempting to refuse. He informed Sarah of the arrangement, assuming she would comply as she always had. This time was different. A house servant named Ruth, present during the conversation, testified that Sarah looked Crane directly in the eye and said very quietly, "I will not go." Crane was stunned. He had owned Sarah for 18 months, and she had never directly disobeyed an order. He repeated the command, louder this time. Sarah refused again, her voice remaining steady and low. Crane's face flushed crimson. He summoned the overseer, ordering Sarah taken to the whipping post immediately. What transpired next became the subject of considerable discussion amongst the enslaved people at Marsh Bend, whispered about for years afterwards. 4 men, including Overseer Grimball, attempted to force Sarah towards the post. She didn't fight them, she simply stopped moving. She planted her feet and became dead weight. The 4 men pulled, pushed, struck her with their fists and a cane. Sarah wouldn't budge. Only after 8 men employed ropes and threats were made to harm other enslaved people if she didn't comply, did Sarah finally walk to the post. The punishment was 30 lashes with a braided leather whip. Witnesses reported that Sarah made no sound throughout the beating, though the rough cotton dress she wore became soaked with blood. When it ended and she was finally released, she walked back to her cabin unaided, her back shredded, but her posture still upright. She didn't go to Charleston. Crane, humiliated before his overseer and workers, eventually told Peyton the arrangement was off, fabricating an excuse about Sarah falling ill. But something had changed at Marsh Bend. True, the other slaves had witnessed that Sarah could be hurt, but they had also witnessed that she could make Josiah Crane back down. That frightened Crane more than he cared to admit. An uneasy equilibrium developed over the following year. Crane continued exhibiting Sarah to visitors at Marsh Bend, but ceased attempting to remove her from the plantation. Sarah continued working the fields with the same quiet, unyielding strength. The punishments persisted, but less frequently, as if Crane understood that each one diminished rather than reinforced his authority. Yet something else was developing beneath the surface of that daily routine. Something that would culminate in a horrifying August night in 1827 and alter everything. Sarah became pregnant in the spring of 1826. No official record documents the father's identity, but testimony from other enslaved people at Marsh Bend tells a consistent story. His name was Marcus, approximately 30 years of age, a carpenter on the plantation skilled in the intricate woodwork required to maintain the floodgate and rice mill systems. Marcus had arrived at Marsh Bend 2 years before Sarah, purchased at an estate sale in Georgetown. People described him as a quiet, thoughtful man who could repair virtually anything. He had lost a wife and daughter years earlier, when they were sold away from him. The relationship between Marcus and Sarah was said to be built on respect rather than passion. In a world where so much was taken from them, where their bodies and labor were owned by another, they found something resembling partnership in one another. They would sit together in the evenings after work, conversing quietly outside the cabins. Marcus would speak of places he had been, things he had built. Sarah would listen. She had been moved so many times as a child that she could scarcely recall her own mother's face. In early 1826, when Sarah discovered she was pregnant, word spread swiftly through the slave quarters. Pregnancy on a plantation was always complicated, full of hope and fresh terror. A child meant family, the possibility of something beyond constant labor. But it also meant vulnerability. It meant another life that could be threatened, sold, or used as leverage. And on a plantation owned by someone like Josiah Crane, it meant danger. Sarah's pregnancy proved difficult from the start. Her size, the very thing that made her valuable to Crane, made carrying a child arduous. She continued working in the fields throughout her first months, as all enslaved women were expected to do. Yet the other women at Marsh Bend noticed she moved more slowly, would occasionally pause to press a hand to her lower back, her face showing a rare flicker of pain. Crane noticed as well, but for different reasons. In his mind, a pregnant slave woman was merely another piece of property, another person he could own, sell, or exploit. He began speaking openly about the baby, remarking to visitors that he expected it would be quite large given the mother's size, speculating on how much it might fetch when old enough to sell. House servants overheard these comments and relayed them to Sarah. They filled her with a cold dread she had never experienced before. She had been beaten, humiliated, exhausted, starved. But the thought of her child being treated as Crane had treated her, displayed as an animal, punished for amusement, perhaps even sold away, became unbearable. Marcus noticed the change in Sarah. Her face grew harder, her eyes more distant. She became even quieter than usual. At night she would sit outside the cabin, hands on her stomach, staring at the main house. Even those who knew her well found the look on her face unsettling. In November 1826, Sarah was removed from field work and assigned lighter duties around the plantation, shelling rice, mending items, working in the kitchen garden. Her belly had grown so large it impeded her usual movement, yet, even in this weakened state, she remained a formidable presence. Kitchen workers reported that when Sarah stood in the doorway of the kitchen building, she completely blocked out the sun. The baby was born in late January 1827, on one of winter's coldest nights. Sarah went into labor just after midnight. Two older enslaved women, Hester and Dinah, who served as midwives for the plantation community, attended her. The labor was prolonged and excruciating. Sarah screamed that night, the same woman who had never cried out during beatings. The sound carried across the frozen fields, waking Crane in the main house. He later mentioned that we had lit a lantern and walked to the slave quarters, standing outside cabin 7, listening to what transpired within. The baby boy was born just before dawn. He weighed nearly 11 pounds, large for a newborn, but appeared healthy and normal in every other respect. Hester would later recount that Sarah wept when the baby cried, the first time anyone at Marsh Bend had witnessed her tears. She held her son against her chest, studying his tiny hands and face, whispering words only she could hear. Shortly after the birth, Marcus was permitted into the cabin. He stood beside Sarah, gazing down at the child. Those present said something passed between them in that moment, some unspoken agreement or understanding. Sarah named her son Jacob, a biblical name common amongst enslaved people, signifying struggle and survival. For a few brief weeks, despite everything, there existed something resembling happiness in cabin 7. Sarah would nurse Jacob, hold him for hours, sing to him in a low voice like distant thunder. Marcus carved small wooden animals for the baby, placing them in the cradle he had constructed. But Josiah Crane was watching, waiting. If you've stayed with us this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make these for. Please do subscribe. By the summer of 1827, Jacob was 6 months old. He was growing rapidly, already larger than most infants his age, and had begun smiling and reaching for objects with his plump hands. Sarah had returned to work, though lighter duties than before, mostly around the plantation buildings. She kept Jacob close always, either carrying him on her hip or back while she worked, or keeping him within sight. Marcus had improved their cabin using scrap wood and his skills, adding a proper door with a latch and a small window with shutters. It remained a slave cabin, barely adequate for human habitation. But it was theirs. And within those rough walls, they attempted to create a family. Yet Josiah Crane's financial difficulties were mounting. He had made unfortunate investments in a failed shipping venture, and the rice market had been unstable for several years. He owed money to numerous creditors who were becoming increasingly insistent. By July 1827, Crane risked losing Marsh Bend entirely unless he could secure funds quickly. The solution seemed straightforward to him: sell some of his slaves. Selling 5 or 6 people would discharge sufficient debt to maintain his position. The question was which ones. On a sweltering, humid Tuesday afternoon in early August, a slave trader named Nathaniel Gadsden arrived at Marsh Bend. Gadsden was a well-known figure in the Charleston market. He purchased enslaved people from financially distressed planters, then resold them at auction or to plantation owners in Georgia and Florida. He was known for driving hard bargains and caring nothing about where families ended up after he purchased them. Crane and Gadsden walked the plantation for several hours, examining enslaved workers, discussing their ages, skills, and potential prices. When they reached the section of yard near the kitchen garden where Sarah was working, Jacob sleeping on her back in a cloth sling, Gadsden stopped and stared. The conversation that followed comes from testimony given by a boy named Peter, who was supposed to be carrying water but had concealed himself behind a woodpile close enough to overhear. This remains the only direct account of what was said. "Lord Almighty, is that the giant woman I heard about?" Gadsden asked. "That is Sarah," Crane replied. 6'8", strongest worker I possess, and the child, her son, approximately 6 months old. Gadsden approached Sarah, circling her whilst she worked, her face expressionless. He seemed particularly interested in Jacob. "How much for the child?" Gadsden inquired. Sarah's hand stopped moving. She didn't turn round, but her entire body went rigid. "I hadn't considered selling him separately," Crane said. "I've a buyer in Savannah. Wealthy family seeking a house servant they can train from infancy. They pay handsomely for children. Easy work, good conditions. I could give you $400 for that baby right now." A lengthy silence followed. Sarah slowly turned to face them, still holding her hoe. Her face was completely blank. "400 today? Cash?" Crane asked. "I bring him with me when I depart this afternoon. Peter reported that Sarah made a sound low in her throat, like an animal, but she didn't speak. Crane glanced at her, then back at Gadsden. I need to consider this. But everyone who heard that conversation understood the truth. Josiah Crane needed $400 more than he needed to keep a 6-month-old infant on his plantation. It was merely a matter of time. That night in cabin 7, Sarah and Marcus whispered urgently to one another until long after dark. No one knows precisely what they said, but the decision they reached would have lasting consequences. The following morning, 13th of August 1827, Marcus was gone. He had vanished during the night, taking nothing except the clothes on his back. It wasn't unusual for an enslaved person to attempt escape from a plantation, though it was extraordinarily dangerous. The roads were patrolled. Slave catchers worked throughout the Low Country with dogs and weapons. The punishment for captured runaways was brutal, but Marcus hadn't fled alone, not in spirit. He carried a detailed map of the plantation, the surrounding area, and the route to Charleston, sewn into his coat lining by Sarah. He also carried a letter addressed to anyone in Charleston who might help, explaining that Josiah Crane intended to sell a baby and pleading for intervention for anything that might prevent it. It was a desperate plan, almost certainly doomed to failure. But it was the only one they possessed. Crane learnt of Marcus's disappearance just after dawn. He was furious. He ordered Overseer Grimble to assemble a search party immediately, to summon the slave patrol, to dispatch riders to Charleston to watch the roads. The plantation descended into chaos as men on horseback spread through the surrounding swamps and fields, seeking any trace of Marcus. They found him just after noon, approximately 8 miles from Marsh Bend. Attempting to cross a creek, the slave patrol had dogs, and Marcus had left a trail through soft mud near the water. They brought him back to Marsh Bend, bound with ropes, bleeding from dog bites on his arms and legs, still alive. What transpired next became the subject of testimony in several legal proceedings over subsequent months, though details varied depending on who was speaking and when. Crane ordered Marcus taken to the whipping post immediately. He declared he would personally administer the punishment, and that it would be so severe it would serve as warning to anyone else contemplating flight. The entire enslaved community was compelled to gather and watch. Sarah was made to stand at the front, holding Jacob. The punishment was brutal, even by the standards of that time and place. 50 lashes delivered with a heavy leather whip. Marcus was bound to the post, his shirt torn away. Crane wielded the whip himself, putting his full strength into each stroke. Blood appeared on Marcus's back after the 5th lash. After the 10th, his skin was torn open in multiple places. After the 20th, he had ceased screaming and hung limp against the ropes. Sarah watched all of it, her face like carved stone, her arms wrapped round Jacob, who was crying now, frightened by the sounds and atmosphere of violence. Witnesses reported that Sarah's eyes never left Marcus's face, and that Marcus, in the brief moments when he was conscious, looked only at her. When it ended, Marcus was cut down and dragged to his cabin, barely conscious. Crane turned to the crowd, his own face flushed and perspiring, blood on his shirt. He announced that anyone who aided a runaway or even knew of a planned escape and failed to report it would receive the same punishment. Then he told everyone to return to work except Sarah. Crane approached her, standing so close she had to look down at him. He was perhaps 5'8", but beside her he appeared almost childlike. Yet his voice was hard and cold. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "Mr. Gadsden returns, and he will take your son. You will not resist. You will hand the child over quietly. If you cause any trouble or make a scene, I will have Marcus beaten again. And this time he will not survive. Do you understand?" Sarah said nothing. She simply stared down at Crane with those dark, unreadable eyes. After a long moment, Crane turned and walked back to the main house. So that night, the plantation was unnaturally quiet. Even the normal sounds of the swamp seemed muted, as if the world itself were holding its breath. In cabin 7, Sarah sat on the floor holding Jacob, rocking him slowly whilst he slept. In another cabin, Marcus lay on his stomach, his shredded back treated with grease and herbs by the other enslaved people. drifting in and out of consciousness. And in the main house, Josiah Crane sat in his library reviewing his account books, calculating how the $400 from selling Jacob would ease his immediate financial pressures. He drank brandy and occasionally glanced out the window towards the slave quarters, his face troubled despite his certainty that he had made the correct decision. None of them knew that the following night would end in blood, mystery, and a legend that would never truly be resolved. The 14th of August, 1827, dawned hot and humid. A typical low-country summer day when the air feels thick enough to choke on. The sun rose blood red over the rice fields, filtered through haze rising from the swamps. Later, people would remember that detail, as if nature itself had been issuing warning of what was to come. Sarah rose before dawn as always. She fed Jacob, changed him, dressed him in the cleanest clothing she possessed, a small cotton gown she had sewn herself. She held him close, whispering to him for a long while, words no one else could hear. Then she carefully placed him in the wooden cradle Marcus had made and went to work. Sarah labored in the kitchen garden all morning, with a kind of mechanical efficiency. The other women working near her reported that she spoke to no one, acknowledged no one, didn't even appear to see anyone. She simply performed her tasks with blank face and precise movements. Several people attempted to speak to her, to offer sympathy or support. She didn't respond. It was as if she had retreated to some place deep within herself, where no one could reach her. Around mid-morning, Nathaniel Gadsden arrived at Marsh Bend in a wagon driven by his assistant, a young man whose name isn't recorded. Gadsden proceeded directly to the main house and was shown into Crane's library, where the two men finalized their transaction. $400 in cash exchanged for ownership papers hastily drawn up for an infant named Jacob, aged 6 months, property of Josiah Crane, now sold to Nathaniel Gadsden. At noon, Crane sent word that Sarah should bring the child to the main house. The message was delivered by a house servant named Ruth, who had the unenviable task of walking to the kitchen garden and informing Sarah it was time to surrender her son. Sarah's reaction proved unexpected. She simply nodded. She set down her hoe, wiped her hands on her dress, and walked calmly to cabin 7. She emerged minutes later carrying Jacob, who was awake and gazing about with curious eyes. She walked towards the main house without hurrying, without hesitating, her face still showing no emotion whatsoever. The other enslaved people watched her go, many weeping. Some expected her to run, to fight, to do something. But Sarah simply walked steadily across the yard, up the steps of the main house, and disappeared inside. The next quarter of an hour is reconstructed from several accounts, primarily from Ruth, who was in the house, and from Overseer Grimble, who was summoned inside during the exchange. Sarah entered the library where Crane and Gadsden waited. She stood just inside the door, holding Jacob against her chest. Crane gestured for her to approach, and she took 3 steps forward, then stopped. The men waited for her to come closer. She did not move. After a lengthy, awkward silence, Crane spoke. "Sarah, give the child to Mr. Gadsden." Sarah looked at Gadsden, then at Crane. She said, "Please," in a voice so low they had to strain to hear it. It was the first time anyone at Marsh Bend had ever heard Sarah beg for anything. Crane's face hardened. "The matter is settled, Sarah. Give him the child. Now." Sarah's arms tightened round Jacob. Her voice grew slightly louder. "Please, I'll work harder. I'll do anything. Please don't take my child." Gadsden shifted uncomfortably. Crane stood from behind his desk, speaking sharply. "You forget yourself. You don't beg. You do as you're told. Give me the child this instant." Sarah remained motionless for a long moment. Then slowly she looked down at Jacob. She kissed his forehead, whispered something to him. Then, with hands that trembled, for the first time anyone had ever witnessed, she held him out towards Gadsden. Gadsden stepped forward and took Jacob from her arms. The baby, sensing the change, began to cry. The sound seemed to fracture something in the room. Sarah's face crumpled for an instant, showing raw anguish before she forced it back into blankness. But her hands, now empty, remained outstretched, as if she couldn't quite comprehend that they no longer held her son. Crane, perhaps feeling a twinge of guilt, or merely wishing the scene concluded, spoke more gently. The child will be well cared for, Sarah. He goes to a good place. You will work, and perhaps one day you'll be able to have more children. Return to work now. Sarah slowly lowered her hands. She looked at Crane with an expression that Ruth would later describe as beyond hatred, beyond despair, something cold and final. Then she turned and walked from the library, from the main house, back towards the slave quarters. Gadsden departed Marsh Bend shortly after midday with Jacob wrapped in a blanket in the wagon, crying for his mother. Sarah was observed standing near cabin 7, watching the wagon roll down the long drive towards the main road. She stood there, unmoving, for nearly an hour after the wagon had vanished from sight. It was a strange, tense afternoon at Marsh Bend. Everyone knew something terrible had occurred, but life on the plantation continued as usual. The work had to be done. The rice wouldn't harvest itself, so people returned to the fields, performing their duties whilst their minds were elsewhere. Sarah returned to work as well, but something was different. Several people later remarked that her movement seemed altered, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. She worked steadily through the afternoon, refusing food when offered, speaking to no one. As full darkness descended, Sarah returned to cabin 7. She didn't eat the evening meal. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, staring at the empty cradle Marcus had built, her face illuminated by the dim light of a single candle. Around 9 o'clock, she stood, extinguished the candle, and left the cabin. Several people witnessed her walking across the plantation grounds towards the main house. Her figure was unmistakable, even in darkness, towering and moving with that strange, quiet grace. One man, an elderly field worker named Solomon, later testified that he called out to her, asking where she was going. Sarah didn't answer. She simply kept walking. At approximately 9:30, the clock in Josiah Crane's library, which would later be discovered, stopped at precisely that time, confirmed it. Sarah Drummond entered the main house through the kitchen door. That night, the main house at Marsh Bend was quiet. Crane had dismissed most of the house servants early, leaving only Ruth and one other servant, an older man named Isaac, who served as butler. Crane himself was in his library, the same room where he had taken Jacob from Sarah's arms just 9 hours earlier. He was working on his account books, sipping brandy whilst reviewing entries that now included $400 from the sale. Ruth was upstairs in one of the bedrooms, preparing it for the night. Isaac was in the kitchen building, separate from the main house, as was typical in plantation architecture, finishing the cleaning from dinner. Neither saw Sarah enter through the kitchen door and walk through the darkened house to the library. What transpired in the next few minutes has been pieced together from physical evidence, accounts from those who arrived shortly after, and one crucial witness, Ruth, who heard sounds from downstairs and went to investigate. Ruth later told the Charleston magistrate that she first heard Crane's voice raised in anger, though not quite shouting. She couldn't discern the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Then she heard another voice, much lower, which she immediately recognized as Sarah's. Ruth descended the stairs quietly, uncertain whether to involve herself. When she had reached the bottom, she heard Crane shout, "How dare you enter this house? Get out immediately, or I shall have you whipped until you cannot stand." Sarah's response was too quiet for Ruth to hear clearly, but it prompted Crane to shout again. "The child is sold. The matter is finished. You possess no rights here. You own nothing, not even yourself." Ruth heard a sound she thought was furniture scraping, perhaps a chair pushed back hastily. Then Crane's voice again, but this time higher. Frightened, "Stay back, don't come any closer, I'm warning you." Ruth, despite her fear, felt a powerful urge to position herself where she could see through the partially open library door. What she witnessed would remain with her for the rest of her life. Sarah stood in the center of the library, her head nearly touching the ceiling. Crane had backed against his desk, his face pale, one hand reaching behind him, as if searching for something. The lamp on the desk cast wild shadows, making Sarah's figure appear even more enormous, almost monstrous. "I want my son back," Sarah said. Her voice was calm, steady. "Impossible," Crane replied. "He is sold. The law is on my side. You are my property, and that child was my property, and I had every right to. I want my son back." Crane's hand found what he sought, a pistol he kept in the desk drawer. He withdrew it and aimed at Sarah with trembling hand. "If you take another step, I will shoot you. I swear to God, I will shoot you where you stand." Sarah looked at the pistol, then stepped forward. "Stop!" Crane's voice broke. "I will do it. I will!" Sarah took another step. She was close enough now to have reached out and touched him. Crane pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Ruth screamed. But when the smoke cleared, Sarah was still standing. The ball had struck her left shoulder, tearing through muscle, striking bone. Yet she hadn't fallen. She had scarcely moved. Blood was spreading across her dress, black in the lamplight. But her face showed no pain, only that same terrible, blank determination. Crane stared at her in shock. He attempted to reload for a second shot, but his hands were shaking too violently. Sarah reached out and took the pistol from him as if it were a toy. She hurled it across the room, where it struck the wall and clattered to the floor. "Where is my son?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Crane said, pressed against the desk with nowhere left to retreat. "Gadsden took him. I don't know where. I promise I don't know." Sarah stood there for a long moment, gazing down at Crane. Blood dripped from her shoulder, striking the floor. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet, Ruth could barely hear it. "You took everything from me. My child, my body, my labor, my dignity. You took it all. What more could you possibly take?" "Please," Crane whispered. "Please, I can retrieve him. I can find him. I can—" But Sarah wasn't listening any longer. She reached out with both hands and grasped Crane by the head, wrapping her enormous hands round his skull the way one might hold a melon. Crane attempted to scream, but the sound was severed almost immediately. Ruth turned and ran. She fled from the house and across the yard, screaming for help. Behind her, from inside the library, she heard a sound like a pumpkin being smashed, followed by the heavy thump of something large falling to the floor. When Overseer Grimble and 2 other men reached the main house, perhaps 3 minutes later, the library was silent. Grimble, carrying a rifle, entered cautiously, expecting violence. What they discovered was worse than violence. It was finality. Josiah Crane lay on the floor beside his desk, on his back, his eyes open and staring at nothing. His head was misshapen, crushed with such force that blood and brain matter had sprayed across the desk and nearby books. The physical evidence was unambiguous. He had been killed by compression, by hands of extraordinary size and strength, squeezing his skull until it fractured and collapsed inward. Sarah was gone. The window behind the desk, which overlooked the rear of the property towards the swamps, stood open. A trail of blood led from Crane's body to the window and out into the darkness beyond. The men stood in shocked silence for a moment, attempting to comprehend what they were witnessing. Then Grimble took command. He dispatched one man to ride to Charleston immediately to alert the authorities. He sent another to gather all the enslaved men to form a search party. He posted guards at the main house to preserve the scene. Even as he issued these orders, Grimble understood in his heart they would not find Sarah Drummond. The swamps surrounding Marsh Bend were vast, dark, treacherous. Someone who knew them well could vanish into that wilderness and never be discovered. Moreover, Sarah had just killed a white plantation owner. Before a witness, she had nothing left to lose. The search commenced within the hour, though it was chaotic and disorganized. Men with torches and dogs spread into the swamps, calling out, crashing through undergrowth. They found the blood trail easily enough, droplets leading from the house into the rice fields, then towards the tree line. But at the swamp's edge, the trail vanished. The ground was too wet, too tangled with vegetation. In the darkness, it proved impossible to track anything with certainty. They searched all night, found nothing. No body, no clothing, no sign Sarah had been there at all, save for that blood trail ending at the swamp's edge, like a line drawn in sand. As dawn broke on the 15th of August, the searchers returned to Marsh Bend, exhausted, empty-handed. The investigation into the horror at Marsh Bend was only beginning. and what it revealed would haunt Charleston society for generations. On the afternoon of the 15th of August, Charleston authorities, led by Magistrate William Huger, accompanied by the sheriff, two deputies, and a physician named Dr. James Priolo, arrived at Marsh Bend. What they encountered was a plantation in chaos, with the enslaved community terrified and silent, the overseer overwhelmed, and a crime scene that defied easy explanations. And Dr. Priolo's examination of Josiah Crane's body was thorough and disturbing. His official report, preserved in the Charleston County Archives, describes injuries consistent with massive compression force applied to the cranium, resulting in multiple fractures, cerebral hemorrhage, and immediate death. The doctor noted that marks on Crane's skull corresponded to fingers of unusual length and breadth, and that the force required to produce such injuries would exceed the capacity of most men, requiring strength of an extraordinary nature. Initially, the investigation focused primarily on locating Sarah. But as days passed up with no sign of her, authorities began interviewing everyone at Marsh Bend. The accounts they collected painted a disturbing picture of life on the plantation, and of Sarah herself. Ruth recounted her testimony, though clearly frightened of the consequences. Isaac had heard the gunshot and witnessed Sarah's bloody trail leading from the house, corroborated her account. Other enslaved people spoke of Sarah's size, her strength, the years of abuse she had endured, and the sale of her child on the morning of the murder. The gunshot wound complicated matters considerably. Authorities recovered the pistol where Sarah had thrown it, and the ball lodged in the wall behind where she had been standing. This meant Crane had shot Sarah before she killed him, raising uncomfortable legal questions about self-defense. Could an enslaved person claim self-defense against their owner? The law said no. Yet the circumstances made even the most hardened magistrates uneasy. Marcus was questioned extensively, still recovering from his beating. He could barely sit upright. Authorities suspected he might know Sarah's whereabouts. Marcus maintained he had been in his cabin all night, too injured to move, and knew nothing of what Sarah had done until he heard the commotion afterwards. Several other enslaved people corroborated his account. Authorities had little choice but to believe him, though suspicion lingered. As news of the murder spread through Charleston and the surrounding Low Country, reactions varied dramatically. The plantation-owning class was outraged and frightened. If an enslaved woman could kill her owner and vanish unpunished, what did that portend for the stability of the entire system? Emergency meetings were convened, patrols increased, new restrictions placed on enslaved people's movements. But in other communities, particularly amongst free black people and those opposed to slavery, the story acquired different meanings. To some, Sarah became a symbol of resistance. To others, a warning about the violence slavery invariably produced. To still others, simply a mother who had reached her breaking point. The search for Sarah continued for weeks, extending far beyond Marsh Bend. Slave catchers were engaged, rewards offered. Reports arrived from throughout the region, sightings of a woman matching Sarah's description. A woman of extraordinary height observed near the Santee River. A giant woman spotted on a road leading north towards North Carolina. A tall woman requesting food at a church in the back country. Yet none of these sightings were ever confirmed. When investigators followed up, they found nothing. It was as if Sarah had been absorbed by the landscape itself, becoming part of the swamps and forests surrounding Marsh Bend. Then, in September 1827, something peculiar occurred. A letter arrived at the Charleston magistrate's office. It bore no return address and had been left at a post office in Columbia, more than 100 miles from Charleston. The handwriting was crude but legible, the spelling imperfect but comprehensible. It read, "To those searching for the woman Sarah, I am still alive, I will not return. I am traveling north to search for my son. Anyone who attempts to stop me will meet the same fate as Josiah Crane. Do not follow me." The letter wasn't signed, but Magistrate Huger believed it genuine. The phrasing, the determination, the threat, all seemed consistent with what he knew of Sarah. Yet it raised more questions than it answered. Had Sarah truly traveled all the way to Columbia? Was she still alive despite the gunshot wound? And most importantly, Did she genuinely intend to search for her son? Authorities chose not to make the letter public, fearing it might inspire other enslaved people or provoke panic amongst plantation owners. Instead, they shared it privately with slave traders and catchers across the region, requesting vigilance for a woman matching Sarah's description, particularly one making inquiries about a child named Jacob sold in August. Nathaniel Gadsden, the trader who had purchased Jacob, was questioned extensively. He confirmed that 2 days after departing Marsh Bend, he had sold the child to a family named Hafford in Savannah, Georgia, for $500. The Haffords were contacted and confirmed they had acquired an infant boy in mid-August and that he was healthy and in their care. Understandably concerned given Sarah's actions, they engaged armed guards to watch their property for months thereafter. As 1827 turned into 1828 and then 1829, the search for Sarah gradually ceased. She had not been located. No credible sightings had been reported. Authorities concluded she had likely perished from a gunshot wound somewhere in the wilderness. Her body never recovered. The case was officially closed, though a standing warrant for her arrest remained on the books for decades. But the story didn't end there. The rumors persisted for years, for decades. In the years following Sarah's disappearance, accounts began circulating throughout the South of encounters with an extraordinarily large woman. These stories were whispered in slave quarters, shared amongst free black communities, even reported by white travelers who claimed to have witnessed something remarkable. In 1831, a group of escaped slaves who had reached Pennsylvania via the Underground Railroad reported that a woman they described as a giant taller than any person they had ever seen had assisted them on their journey. She moved through the forest like a spirit, they said, and knew every hidden path. When they asked her name, she replied only, "I'm searching for my son." In 1835, a plantation overseer in northern Georgia claimed he encountered a woman resembling Sarah at the edge of his property, making inquiries about recent slave sales. When he attempted to detain her, she lifted him with one hand and cast him aside like a child. By the time he secured help, she had vanished. In 1842, a Quaker woman operating a safe house on the Underground Railroad in Ohio wrote in her diary about a visitor who stayed one night. A woman of remarkable height and powerful presence arrived at our door seeking shelter and information regarding the whereabouts of a child sold from Charleston years ago. She would not provide her name. She bore scars from past violence. She wept when we told her we knew nothing of her son. By morning, she had departed. These accounts, along with dozens of others, became part of the legend of Sarah Drummond. But were they genuine encounters or myths born of hope and fear? The historical record provides no definitive answers. What we do know is that in the years after 1827, several plantations in South Carolina and Georgia reported thefts of food, clothing, and medicine, with witnesses describing the thief as a woman of unusual height. Some plantation owners became convinced Sarah was living in the swamps and forests, surviving on stolen provisions, perhaps even assisting other runaways in their escape to freedom. A plantation owner named Samuel Gilliard kept a diary that provides considerable detail. His property adjoined the Francis Marion National Forest in South Carolina. In an entry from 1838, Gilliard wrote, "My overseer insists he witnessed the giant who killed Josiah Crane all those years ago. He claims she was standing so motionless at the tree line at dusk that she appeared part of the forest itself. When he approached, she simply turned and walked into the woods. He followed her for a mile, but the trail ended at a creek. I know not whether to believe him or attribute this to an overactive imagination fueled by whiskey, yet he was genuinely shaken, and he is not a man given to fabrication." Sarah's story held different meanings for different communities. For enslaved people, she became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the most oppressed person could confront their oppressor. Songs were sung about her in the slave quarters, though always carefully, always in code. In some versions, Sarah became a kind of avenging spirit, protecting runaways and punishing cruel masters. Amongst white Southerners, particularly plantation owners, Sarah became a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing enslaved people too far, and also a monster story used to justify even harsher controls and punishments. Some claimed she had become feral, living in the swamps. Others insisted she had gone mad and would attack any white person she encountered. These stories, however absurd, revealed deep anxieties about the slavery system itself, and what might transpire if that system were truly challenged. In the North, free black communities and abolitionists told another version of Sarah's story. In their telling, she became a hero who had fought for freedom and escaped to the North, perhaps even Canada. Some said she had been reunited with her son. Others claimed she had become an active conductor on the Underground Railroad, using her knowledge of the southern wilderness to guide hundreds to freedom. As is often the case with legends, the truth was likely far less dramatic and far more tragic than any of these narratives. What is certain, Sarah Drummond was never apprehended, never confirmed dead, and never seen again with any certainty by anyone who could substantiate it. I've examined every document, testimony, and piece of evidence that survives from that August night in 1827 and the years that followed. I cannot state with absolute certainty what became of Sarah Drummond after she climbed through that library window and vanished into the swamps. But I can tell you what the evidence suggests. The gunshot wound Sarah sustained from Josiah Crane was severe. The coroner's report noted the blood at the scene consistent with a serious injury. Dr. Priolo, examining the scene the following day, opined that without medical intervention, such a wound would likely become infected and prove fatal within days or weeks. Sarah couldn't seek medical assistance. She was a fugitive in a hostile territory where men with dogs and weapons were searching for her. The most probable scenario, the one most historians who have studied this case accept, is that Sarah died within days of escaping Marsh Bend. She likely travelled some distance into the swamps, perhaps following waterways where dogs couldn't track her scent, but eventually succumbed to her wound. Her body, if she perished in the deep swamps, would have been swiftly consumed by the ecosystem. Alligators, wild pigs, the simple process of decomposition in that hot, humid environment. Within weeks, nothing would remain to discover. This explanation accounts for why no confirmed sightings of Sarah ever occurred, why authorities never located any substantial evidence of her continued existence, and why the blood trail from Marsh Bend ended so abruptly. It is the rational, evidence-based conclusion. And yet, there are details that don't quite fit this tidy explanation. The letter sent to Columbia was genuine. Someone wrote it, and they possessed knowledge about Sarah that wasn't public. If Sarah died in the swamps near Marsh Bend, who composed that letter? The reports from Underground Railroad operatives are also difficult to dismiss entirely. These were serious individuals, committed to their cause, not prone to spreading false rumors. When they reported encountering a woman resembling Sarah, they did so in private correspondence and diaries, not in public statements intended to inspire or mislead. And there is one final piece of evidence I've reserved until now, because it is perhaps the most intriguing and the most difficult to verify. In 1889, 62 years after Josiah Crane's death, a Philadelphia physician named Dr. Robert Hayes was attending an elderly black woman on her deathbed. In her final days, she told Dr. Hayes a story. She claimed her mother had been an escaped slave from South Carolina, a woman of extraordinary size who had killed her owner in the 1820s. The woman said her mother had survived for years in the wilderness before eventually reaching the North with assistance from free black communities and Quaker abolitionists. She said her mother had searched for her first child, a son named Jacob, for more than a decade, but never located him. Eventually, she had settled in Pennsylvania, assumed a new name, and lived quietly until her death in 1867. Dr. Hayes wrote to a colleague about this conversation, remarking that he found the woman's account remarkable, but couldn't verify it. The woman died 2 days after their conversation, and Dr. Hayes never learnt her name or attempted to investigate her claims. The letter was discovered by a historian researching Civil War era medical practices in Philadelphia in 2003. Could this woman have been Sarah Drummond's daughter? Could Sarah truly have survived, truly escaped, truly lived to old age in Pennsylvania? We shall never know with certainty, The evidence is too thin, too circumstantial, and separated by too many years. What we do know, what is incontrovertibly documented and genuine, is what transpired on the night of 14th August, 1827, in that library at Marsh Bend. We know that a woman who had been treated as property, exhibited as a curiosity, worked to exhaustion, beaten and humiliated, finally reached a point where she had nothing left to lose. We know that when her child was taken from her, when the last thing she had to cherish was torn from her arms and sold for $400, something within her fractured. Or perhaps it didn't fracture. Perhaps it crystallized into something hard and final and unstoppable. We know that Josiah Crane died that night, his skull crushed by Sarah's bare hands. We know that Sarah disappeared and was never found. And we know that for nearly 2 centuries, people have wondered and debated and told stories about what truly became of the giant slave woman of Charleston. The truth is probably simpler and sadder than the legends. But the legends endure because they speak to something fundamental about the human spirit and what occurs when that spirit is pushed beyond endurance. Sarah Drummond, whether she perished in those swamps or lived to old age in Pennsylvania, became more than one woman. She became a symbol of resistance, of maternal love, of the breaking point where oppression transforms into rage, and rage into action. And perhaps that is why her story has never been forgotten, even when the facts themselves have become uncertain. Because we want to believe that Sarah survived. We want to believe she found her son, or at least that she lived free for some years before her death. We want to believe that someone who suffered so profoundly and fought back so fiercely received something more than a solitary death in a swamp. But history doesn't care what we wish to believe. It cares only about what occurred and what can be proven. The documented truth is this: Sarah Drummond killed Josiah Crane on the 14th of August, 1827, and then vanished from history as if she had never existed at all. Yet she did exist. The sale records, the medical examinations, the testimonies, and most importantly, Josiah Crane's crushed skull, all prove it. Sarah Drummond was real. What she did was real. And somewhere in the swamps of South Carolina, the forests of Georgia, or perhaps in a quiet grave in Pennsylvania, her remains still lie. We can be rather more certain about what became of Jacob, Sarah's son. Records indicate the Hafford family of Savannah raised him as a house servant. He lived until 1891, dying at the age of 64, buried in a small cemetery outside Savannah. Following emancipation, Jacob worked as a carpenter and established his own family. In the 1930s, when the Federal Writers Project interviewed his descendants, they reported that Jacob knew his mother's story and what she had done. He told his children he always carried with him a small wooden toy carved in the shape of a horse, made by his father Marcus before he was sold from Marsh Bend. He named his first daughter Sarah. This mystery reveals to us that even in the darkest chapters of American history, there were people who refused to be dehumanized, who fought back against impossible odds, and who became legends simply because they dared to resist. What do you make of this story? Do you believe Sarah reached the north and survived? Or did she perish in the swamps near Charleston? Do you think the physician's account from 1889 was genuine or merely another legend built on hope? If you've enjoyed this story and want more historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and enduring legend, do subscribe, enable notifications, and share this with someone who appreciates tales that challenge us to question what we think we know about the past.